Hey fearsome friends. Tonight I'd like to introduce Derek Weber. I really enjoy the way he reads, and I hope that you do too. So go check out his channel. The link is in the description below. So after the poll that I put out the other day, it's been voted that I just keep the same noise in between the stories as before, but I'll turn it down a little bit, just for the ones that want to relax. We've got a great mix of disturbing Let's Not Meet stories for you, and I hope you enjoy them. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. One night, a couple of friends and I went on a hike in the woods to smoke some weed. We all went to our usual hangout spot, which is called Sunshine Grove, and it's a small flat clearing with a close proximity to a high school nearby. It's a common place for kids to go and drink or smoke. It was around 10 or 11 p.m, and as we entered the grove, myself and 4 friends, we saw 2 men camping out there. They had a campfire burning, a tent, and a bottle of wild turkey. We said hello and went on our way to a small wood fort around 60 feet from the clearing, to smoke and chill for a while. We finished our business, got super high, and then decided to head back to the car, which was parked about a 20-minute walk up the hill where the trail began. I should mention now that one of my friends has mental health issues, and is very spacey and odd, especially when he gets high. He would get very silent and out of it. Needless to say, this guy probably shouldn't have been getting high with us in the first place. Anyway, as we exited the clearing, we said goodbye to the camping guys, who at this point were completely drunk, as they'd drunk the majority of the bottle they had. We walked through the darkness and hiked up the hilly terrain, joking around and talking, when I noticed that the odd friend I'd mentioned earlier wasn't with the group. I'm not used to him talking much, so I hadn't even noticed until we were around halfway to the car. When I called him and got his voicemail, I became a bit concerned, so we decided to all turn back to look for him. I re-entered Sunshine Grove, and because the entrance is kind of a bitch to traverse, I went by myself while my friends chilled and waited for me nearby. Just then, when I turned the corner and entered the clearing, I saw both the drunk guys surrounding my friend and were groping him, appearing to try to undress him. My friend was frozen stiff. It seemed like he was in a trance, but he snapped out of it as I ripped him away by his arm and started screaming at these sick guys. They backed off and we both ran into the opposite direction towards the rest of our friends, and within the hour we'd assembled a larger group and went looking for the guys. They backed off and we both ran in the opposite direction, but when we returned to Sunshine Grove, their camp was gone, and I never saw them again. I've seen other weird stuff out there too, like a small neo-Nazi gathering, an abandoned weed growing operation, and a full mountain lion corpse. There's also a rusted out old car from the 40s crashed into a ravine, as well as a 40-foot rope swing. I've had lots of fun out there as a teen, and got poison oaked many times.
Back when I was 13, this was maybe 20 odd years ago now, I used to ride my bike everywhere. I grew up in a small village about 3 miles from the nearest bigger village where my school was and where all my friends lived. I remember this clearly as it stuck with me ever since it happened. In the summer holidays, I used to bike to meet my friends for the day, as you did when you were 13. Anyway, this one warm, sunny day, I was on my bike and the road I had to travel was very rural, with not a lot of traffic and woods on both sides of the road for most of the way. I was biking along, minding my own business, when a motorbike came around the corner and drove past me. I carried on pedaling and heard what I thought was another motorbike coming up behind me. It went past, and I thought it looked familiar, but kind of didn't even think much of it. Next thing I knew, the motorbike came towards me again and went past. This happened twice more until he pulled up in front of me and asked me where the nearest petrol station was. I told him I didn't know, and he thanked me anyway and drove off. 2 minutes later, he's back again. By this time, I was getting a bit freaked out as he had driven past me about 8 times or so. This time, he stopped right in front of me, so I had to stop. He told me he thought I was a pretty girl and asked if he could take me out for a drink. I politely said no thanks and went to carry on my way when he dropped his bike to the floor and made a grab for me. I somehow managed to get around him and started pedaling furiously, and to be honest, by this point I was filling my pants. I heard his bike coming down the road behind me again, but I saw a car coming in front of me, so I dropped my bike and stood in the middle of the road and waved my arms, frantically. Luckily, the car stopped, and it was a woman, and I half said to her what was happening in between crying. The bike guy saw this and accelerated away, thank God. The lovely woman offered to drive me home, but I was too scared to trust a stranger after that only 2 minutes previously. I carried on to my friend's house and told her, but was too scared to tell her parents or mine in case I got in trouble for some reason. I'll be forever grateful to that woman who happened to be in the right place at the right time.
As a teenager, I frequented after-hour clubs where you could go to dance, drink and mingle, and IDs were never checked. My friends and I would load up in the car and head to these clubs after the regular ones closed around 1 or 2. I had divorced parents at the time, and fibbing about where I was staying on a Friday or Saturday night was a little too easy. Also, the friends I went out with had parents that didn't care how late we stayed out. The after-hours club scene was noisy, with loud cover bands, people jammed in drinking, dancing, talking, and making plans for whatever the night brought next. It was an indulgent time in my life, and I loved hanging out with my friends. You got to know the people at the after-hours clubs, and started recognizing them and knowing their names. One club that I went to had a layout where the pool tables and bar were on one side, and the dance floor and live band, with another bar along with a few tables, were on the other side. As you walked in the club, you immediately had to go right or left, because if you went straight, you went into either the men's or women's restroom. So when you had to make a bathroom trip, you had to go into the hallway by the front entrance. One late night, I went to the ladies' room without one of my girlfriends. I'm a female. But it was such a free and crazy time, and I was unafraid and not jaded. I just didn't think about the safety of going up by the front door by myself at 3 a.m. As I exited the bathroom to return to the dance side of the club, a man, a few years older than me, was exiting from the pool table side of the bar and was heading out to the parking lot. In an instant he grabbed me around the waist and just carried me out the front door. His height, weight, and strength exceeded mine by a lot, and he got a few paces from the front door with me kicking and screaming when a friendly face walking back into the club appeared. He was a friend of a friend, but definitely an angel that night. He could tell I was in distress, so he stopped, called me by my name and put his hand on my arm and told me there was no way I was leaving without the dance I had promised him. The stranger put me down and said he was just teasing me, then took off. The friend of a friend made sure I made it back inside safely, and my girlfriends and I decided that that was enough drinking and dancing and breaking curfews for one night. I don't know what the stranger's intentions were, and thanks to fortunate timing, during what could have turned out to be a very bad club encounter, I was okay.
Alright, so check this out. When my friend and I met the woman we now refer to as the Banshee, it was about 10 at night. We were walking back from a milk tea place and we were maybe at mile 5 of a 6-mile total round trip, almost home. We were walking on a long stretch of sidewalk next to a wide road that's busy during the day, but almost empty at night. A little background. My hiking buddy and I sometimes go for long walks through town at night when we can't get to trails during the day. It's dark, but our routes go through a fairly safe blend of residential and shopping areas. Usually, we head to some sort of late-night restaurant or food truck. We walk, stop for food and drink, and then head back. We wear glowing vests that are battery-powered and reflective stuff to make sure traffic sees us, because we've had some too close encounters with distracted drivers. We've also had a few encounters with strange people. She didn't start making strange noises at first. It was a long stretch of straight sidewalk, and we had seen her coming for a long time before she started that. No one else was out walking along the road at this hour. There were plenty of street lights. She'd appear under the lights, and then disappear in some shadow of bushes and trees, and then reappear under the lights again. We were glowing in our vests in addition to the street lights, so she had to have seen us coming too. I figured she worked at one of the shops or the restaurants nearby and was just getting done with closing up. I figured she was trying to get home, just like we were, until she started making these random noises. The first sounds were like an odd, hacking noise, like she was trying to clear her throat as noisily as possible, but that was just a warm-up. The sound changed to something like a cross between a crow cawing and a small dog's bark. Rendering that in text form is hard, but the closest thing might be, "Gra! Gra!" So we kept walking towards her, watching and listening, thinking perhaps she had a disability or some other issue. She looked decently dressed and she walked steadily and deliberately, not like someone on drugs. If not for her noises, she seemed completely normal. Then she made these loud but low-pitched groaning sounds, something like It had us briefly making zombie movie references, just having a joke. We speculated if she was maybe talking to someone on earbuds or making an attempt at singing something, but it got weirder as she added some higher-pitched, screechy sounds, something like an angry cockatoo might make, like cry, cry. At this point, she's less than 2 blocks away, and she's rotating through these bizarre sounds with short pauses of silence between. She looked like someone's cute little grandma. She didn't look anything like you'd expect to see making those sounds. She's wearing an old-fashioned thick skirt, a cardigan, some clunky-looking shoes, and she's carrying a single cloth shopping bag. Her hair is short and curly like an old lady perm. She looks adorable, but she sounds insane. Cry! Cry! Ah! She's getting closer, and her bizarre noises are getting more unsettling, and I realize I can't see what she's clutching in her other hand, the one that doesn't have a shopping bag. She looks harmless, but the sounds are too weird. My buddy looked at me and asked, "Time to cross?" Echoing my own thoughts. We didn't want a confrontation with this woman. I nodded, but just before we stepped out into the road, the lady seemed to have the same idea. She suddenly veered off the sidewalk and went into the road, making a steady, diagonal line toward the other side. There wasn't any traffic on the road at this point, so I wasn't worried. I actually relaxed a bit, and we continued on. I figured she was avoiding us, just like we were about to avoid her. But just as we started to pass her, she suddenly screamed and rushed at us from the middle of the road. Her mouth was wide open as she charged at us, just shrieking. We stepped quickly apart, and her abrupt rush took her right between me and my friend, just shriek-wailing that horrible sound. It sounded like it would hurt her throat. Banshee-like is the only word I have for it. We were several feet apart, both braced for her to come back and do something, but instead she veered again and went down the sidewalk the way she had originally been going. As she walked away, she kept looking back at us, keeping short bursts of the shrieking banshee noise, stopping to take breaths. As she got further away from us, she started caw-barking at us again. We stood there for a while, just silently watching until she was a good long ways off down the sidewalk, with her very strange crow barks fading in the distance. I still have no idea what was wrong with her. Did our lights somehow trigger an episode? I hope she's okay. She seemed to know where she was going. But hey, Banshee lady, let's not meet again.
The following story happened to me a few years ago. In hindsight, I was a lot more naive, and I've grown a lot since then, becoming more aware of the risks of using social media without privacy settings. A few years ago, I left my home country to start my master's course and a new life halfway across the world. Besides my partner, their family and my housemates, I didn't really know anyone in the area. The first few months were quite hard. I had never lived more than a 3-hour drive from my parents, so being 9,000 miles away from everything I'd ever known and loved was quite difficult. I found myself using social media more than ever. Facebook, Instagram, etc. It was such a comforting feeling scrolling through my phone and seeing familiar faces, watching stories of friends hanging out in places we all used to visit together, and getting to chat in my native language. It made me feel less lonely, and quite frankly I enjoyed sharing pictures and stories of my new city life with friends and family. It was such a low-effort way of keeping in touch, and it made me feel as if I was still a part of their daily lives. I'm not a social media influencer. I don't have a large following. Almost all people I know personally, and at the time, I followed everyone back, thinking it was some sort of unspoken internet courtesy. I mainly posted pictures of landmarks, beaches, old buildings, and anything I thought looked interesting and that my friends back home would enjoy seeing, since where I live now is heaps different from my hometown. One day I noticed I had a DM request from an account I didn't recognize. It read, "Hello Lynn, follow me." The profile picture was nothing out of the ordinary. A black and white photograph of someone's back standing on a cliff or mountain. Initially I thought it was a bot, but when I clicked into the profile, I was surprised by the content. Beautiful black and white film photographs of different places around the world. There were no pictures where I could make out a face, and the about me was very simple, with a camera emoji and a name. Since I liked the content, I decided to respond to the message with a, "Hello, I love your photography. Followed." I received a reply almost instantly. "Thank you." Then they asked how I was doing. I asked them what kind of camera they used. It was such an innocent, ordinary conversation, and I thought nothing of it. The next day I woke up to a row of notifications, all from the same user. They had liked every single one of my photos, going years back into my feed, and sent me more messages. In one they'd asked how I was enjoying X, the city I had moved to not too long ago. I gave a short one-word answer and a smiley face for good measure. But when they asked what area I was living, I instantly felt weird and decided to not keep the exchange going. So I left them on read. This caused a flood of messages from their end, now apologizing for asking and explaining that they had asked because they swear they'd seen me before and wanted to know if I worked at Anytime Fitness in X, a borough in my city, which I didn't. Thinking this would be the end of the conversation, I replied with a, "Sorry, I think you've got the wrong person. I don't work there." A few moments later I got another message asking if I was sure. I didn't reply, so they sent another. "You wouldn't lie to me, would you?" Then another. "Where do you work?" Buzz, 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 one after the other. At this point I started to get anxious. I hate confrontation, and used to get very anxious over any little altercation where I might have upset someone, so I unfollowed and blocked the account. I mentioned it to one of my housemates and my partner, both of which said it was just some internet troll with too much time on their hands, and I did good by blocking them. But after about a week or so, I received another strange DM request. The profile picture was a screenshot of a scene from the Bunal film, Un chien andalou, and the profile had one single photo. The same screenshotted image. The message read, Why did you unfollow me?" I blocked it immediately. After this, I started receiving a wave of messages from other fake accounts on all my social media. The messages became more and more aggressive, calling me a liar and a cunt. Then randomly, I'd get one asking how my day was or if I had watched a certain movie before. I tried contacting Facebook and Instagram, but honestly, I don't think anything came from it, except maybe the accounts were terminated. I changed all my privacy settings to private, but still the messages continued. I was so overwhelmed and wondered why someone would go out of their way to do this to me. I had just moved country, started school, was trying so hard to start over somewhere so foreign to me. I had never experienced any type of bullying back home. I didn't have any enemies. Who would do this? My partner suggested I screenshot the messages and get the police involved. But back then, I was so nervous to do anything that I just let it be. I figured the police would ignore a foreigner or tell me to grow a backbone, something I grew up hearing. This game of blocking and deleting profiles continued, until my partner, seeing how upset this was making me, messaged one of the accounts, telling them to leave me alone and that they were contacting the police if they continued. The account either deleted or blocked my partner, because it disappeared and things went quiet. After a few weeks, I decided to reactivate my account on Facebook and return to Instagram, hoping things had cooled down. And they had. No requests, no messages. It had been almost 2 months since the start of this whole ordeal, and I was message-free. I was in a much better place. I had made some friends, was enjoying my studies, my job. The incident became nothing but a creepy memory. But then one day, while I was out grocery shopping at a shopping centre, a 15-minute walk from my home, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. My hands were full of grocery bags, so I ignored it until I got home. When I opened the message, it was from another unfamiliar account, with a black and white profile picture of just an eye. Immediately my heart sank and my stomach started to turn. I began thinking, is this the same person after all this time? It can't be. My body started getting hot and a bit shaky. I opened the message and all it said was, "Hi friend." Then they had sent a link to a clip from Back to the Future. I was so confused as to why they were messaging, let alone sending a random movie clip. But then I remembered what I was wearing, a Back to the Future t-shirt. I blocked the user right away and deleted my profile, for good this time. After that, I never heard from them again. It's been a few years since then. I still don't have an Instagram account, and I only use Facebook to keep in touch with old classmates. I never post anything personal. Occasionally I will share a Conan clip here and there, but I never figured out who was messaging me. If it was the same person, why were they doing this? And worst of all, if they had been watching me, I don't know if it was a strange prank or pure coincidence. In hindsight, it seems so silly how much it all got to me. But please, not to sound like an overprotective mother, be careful what you share, when you tag a location, and who you follow. Stay safe, and strange black and white Instagram user, let's not meet, ever. I'm French, and a few years ago I was dating a lovely man for whom I have a lot of respect. He's a good person and the perfect man. His name is Noah. Unfortunately though, we broke up because I had to move away to begin my training as a magistrate. It was a peaceful breakup, and we have a lot of affection for each other still. We're good friends, and our families are friends too. It's kind of funny, because he lives where my parents live, and I live in the same neighborhood as Noah's parents. It's a friendly and caring relationship that we have now. Now, because of COVID, I can't go to see my parents for Christmas and New Year, so I spent the holidays with Noah's parents. 2 weeks later in January, I left my house to go to work, when I noticed that someone had written some insults on my door and my car had been scratched. My blood froze and I was in shock. Now, you should know that magistrates in France are protected. Fines and prison sentence are even harsher when an offence is committed against them. I was a little afraid it was due to a case I was working on. I deal mainly with land cases and buildings, but there are people who are crazy sometimes. It's not a reasonable fear though, as I work on cases without dangerous people, but I had to contact the cops and inform the court, etc., and these kinds of stories are not taken lightly. The police quickly found out who the person was behind it. Someone called Elsa. At that time in France, anyone leaving their home after 7 p.m. without permission was fined €135. The day before, someone had been caught 2 kilometers away and fined. The police asked me if I knew the person who had done this. She was a lady in her mid-60s, and her face was unknown to me, and I wasn't going to withdraw my complaint. A week later, I got a call from Noah, who warned me that he was visiting his parents with his girlfriend, whom he'd been dating for a year. We're both friends on social media, and she's a nice person. At that time in France, to move between different regions, you had to have a good reason, and I didn't ask him about it. I just told myself he wanted to see his parents, and that he'd found an excuse to come. That night I came home from work, and was surprised to see the crazy old lady near the entrance of my building, and she had clearly been drinking. I was on the defensive and ready to fight if it became unpleasant. She called me a whore, and accused me of trying to get in between her and her daughter's boyfriend. I didn't say anything. I just let her talk, standing there stunned. Furious, I called the police, who tried to calm the old lady down. I was escorted up to my apartment by a few men, because my presence made her so angry. Later I learned that she'd gotten into a van, but they had stopped her, as she was too drunk to drive. It was then only a few days later that I learned the truth. Noah visited me on weekends with his girlfriend, and she told me that they'd come for her mother, who was diagnosed with dementia. Apparently she'd almost assaulted someone, and police found a shotgun in the back of her car. A little panicked, I asked if her mother's name was Elsa. The police and doctors thought she was just crazy, and that she wanted to attack me for no reason. But Noah's girlfriend explained that it was because I had spent Christmas with her boyfriend's parents. Her mother had taken the news very badly, and was afraid that her daughter would lose her boyfriend. I'd rather laugh about it than cry. But the mother is now being treated, and I withdrew my complaint. I think about this story now, because I learned that Noah and his girlfriend are expecting a baby.
This happened many years ago. I was 8 or so at the time, and every day I would walk home from my elementary school. My house was a few miles down the road, so my mother thought it would be safe enough for me to walk by myself. It was a few months into the school year when it started happening. A beat-up-looking Toyota would slow down enough for a couple of white guys that looked like they were in their mid to late 20s to follow me and yell insults at me. I was chubby back then, so they would call me fat and much more hurtful things. I'll always remember the driver. He looked to be the oldest of the bunch, with greasy blonde hair hanging down and partially covering his pimple-scarred face. They would follow me until I reached the gas station that was halfway along my journey home. Then they would speed off, laughing loudly. For the first couple of weeks, I didn't tell anyone, thinking they would get tired of it. They didn't. A full month passed before I told my mother about it. She, of course, was rightly concerned about me and asked me how long this had been going on for. When I told her a month, she grew even more concerned. Her being a single mom, she couldn't pick me up from school because she was at work all day long, so her solution was to send my older brother to meet me halfway, thinking this would deter them. It didn't. Another 4 months went by with them continuing to follow me and throw insults at me. Then suddenly it stopped. A whole month went by without them driving by, and we thought everything was safe again. But we were wrong. Suddenly, out of the blue, I saw the old beat-up Toyota heading down the road towards me. Only the driver was in the car this time. He slowed down the car, flung open the passenger door, and proceeded to yell for me to get into the car. I was so scared I couldn't even speak. I just shook my head no and tried to walk faster. He continued to follow me, demanding that I get into his car. I'll never forget the look on his face as he yelled at me. It was so full of rage. We finally got to the gas station and I made a break for it. I ran inside the gas station and up to the attendant. I told him what was happening and he let me hide behind the counter. The driver came in. He demanded that the gas station attendant tell him where I was, claiming I was his daughter and that I had jumped out of his car. The gas station attendant glanced down at me and I shook my head wildly, mouthing that I didn't know who this guy was. The gas station attendant said that he didn't know what he was talking about and that he had to leave the store immediately. The driver began to scream wildly and started walking around the store looking for me. The gas station attendant said he was going to call the police if the man didn't leave. The man turned to him and said something I'll never forget. "I'll get that girl, one way or another." The driver stormed out of the gas station and left. I sat there on the floor crying for what felt like hours. The gas station attendant called the police and had them come over. When the police arrived, the attendant told them what had happened, and an officer knelt down beside me and asked me my side of the story. I told the officer everything, how him and a couple of others have been following me for months, how they would follow me and insult me, and then they suddenly stopped, and how he tried to get me into his car. I don't remember much afterwards other than them calling my mother and her meeting at our house. They took my mother's statement and then left. After that, my mother changed her work hours in order to come get me every day. For years, I lived in fear that that man with the greasy hair and the pimple-scarred face would eventually get me. So to the man who followed me for months, insulting me and eventually trying to get me into his car, I'm not that scared little girl anymore. We better never meet.
I recently remembered this story when I was walking by the playground. It took place about 6 to 7 years ago, when I was about 11 years old, when one summer evening, 4 kids that lived on my street and I decided to go to the playground that was only 100 meters away from our homes. The oldest of us was about 15 or 16, and the only boy in our group. And the other kids were all younger than me, but I don't remember their exact ages. They were still in elementary school at that time, and we'd never spent that much time together. But after what happened, we never spent any more time with each other. I'm honestly not too sad about it either. But anyway, back to the story. The playground was sectioned into a football field in the front and the actual playground in the back. A huge hedge grew on the left side of the field and the playground, and it stopped for a little entrance in the back of the playground where you could crawl through and find a very narrow path that led between 2 different fields where some deers were held. You could only move along when you were facing one side of the high fence because of how narrow the space was, which made each movement very slow. The path basically led nowhere but to a garden. The wall of a building facing the end of the path, which was used as storage, and there was a path behind the hedge that could also be entered from the entry on the street. We had a great time at the playground, climbing up the slide and sliding down, while 2 of us swung on the swings being pushed by another kid. We eventually got bored and decided to take a seat near the area where the sand was, and just played there. As we talked, we heard a distorted voice coming from behind the hedge. We all went quiet immediately, as we didn't know the exact location of where the voice was coming from, based on the info about the path behind the hedge. Pretty terrified at that moment, because it was getting dark, we eventually found the tall figure standing behind the entrance of the hedge. It looked like it was wearing a long black coat with a hood and held a torch in its hand. It was holding something that burned anyway. It was hard to see as leaves covered most of it, and I can only remember this moment in pictures. It's quite blurry. We all looked at each other, silently communicating what we should do. I suggested with a nod of my head just to make a run for it and sprint to the safety of our homes. But I was met with 4 disapproving looks. One of the younger kids yelled at the figure to F off and leave us alone. But the replying voice was so distorted, I couldn't understand what it was saying, and frankly I didn't want to know. The other younger kids joined in on basically insulting the figure and telling it to go away, when I think it started to sort of growl or scream, which terrified us so much. We then, as I suggested in the first place, ran out of there. As we did, I yelled at them for how stupid they'd been for yelling at whatever it was, and what we would do if it chased us. But I was then told to shut up and just run, until we were at the nearest house. Luckily we weren't followed, and returned home safely. From what I can recall, we never told anyone about what happened that day, and just spent some more time together until each of us went home. 1 or 2 years later, I got closer with a classmate of mine and told him about the incident. He claimed that it was him with his 2 younger brothers. I didn't believe him, because when they would sit or stand on each other's back, they still wouldn't have been as tall as the figure we saw on that summer evening, because the figure was as tall as a grown male adult. He still claimed it was him, and he just used a device in order to distort his voice. But I still didn't quite believe him. The property was immediately close to his home, but he would have had to have entered the property of his neighbour first, which is 2 houses next to his place, in order to walk on the narrow path towards the playground. And I doubted that he would be so fast to appear and disappear with 2 other people. He'd probably tried to just placate me by saying that it was him, but I don't know. I still don't know if it was him, and I don't think I will ever find out. But I am convinced it was human, and not a demon or something like that. I guess in the end I subconsciously accepted his claims, to find peace with whoever we'd encountered on that playground.
This event took place in the early summer at a state park in Washington. I lived there for a while with 2 friends, one of whom was a park ranger and lived in a house on park property. I was coming back from a walk with my dog when I see a maroon truck. Why is it always a maroon car? It was parked outside of the closed-off parking lot. This also happens to be outside of the house I'm walking towards to get back home. A man is standing outside of the truck and he's crouched down, pointing something directly at me. I slow my pace and I stare back as I notice that whatever he's got pointed at me is following me as I move. For perspective, he's probably 40 meters away from me. And immediately I think to myself, oh my God, he's pointing a gun at me. He's going to shoot me. The man shouts out, "Must be nice being able to walk in the park." I go into survival panic mode and book it back behind the concrete bathroom so he can't see me. I never felt so exposed in my life, like nowhere was safe. Even the air was toxic. Somehow I know it's a gun that's being aimed, with the way he was crouched, the bending of his arms, the way it was pointed and tracking me. Then he shouts, "Oh, don't worry, we don't mind." I think to myself, who is we? I'm even more creeped out now. My heart is racing and I feel trapped. Luckily, both of my friends were home when I called the guy first. He doesn't answer. Then I quickly call his wife and she picks up, thank God. I called him in the middle of an at-home haircut, which I found comical, after the fact. I'll call him Henry for the sake of privacy. So Henry, the park ranger, gets into his ranger gear as quickly as he could and comes out to meet the man. I'm nervous because I believe the man is armed and Henry, at this point in his position, does not have a gun. After I see that Henry has approached the man and that they're talking, I slowly walk my way back to the house. I pass by the man and get chills. Yeah, he looks like a total creeper. I make it inside and watch anxiously from the front window with Henry's wife. In all honesty, at any moment I'm expecting things to get violent. My phone was open and ready to dial 911. After about a good 10 minutes, Henry returns and the first thing he says is, well, he's definitely a weirdo. He didn't see a gun, but strongly believed the man was hiding one in his waistband with the way he was holding himself, and he had some strange hand movements too, like maybe he was consciously aware of the gun and nervous. Henry asked what he was pointing at me, and the man said a phone to take pictures. He literally admitted that there were pictures of me on his phone. Henry wanted to ask him to delete them, but he didn't because he felt nervous about the possible gun while he himself was unarmed. Honestly, the pictures are creepy, but I really stick to my gut feeling that that wasn't a camera. It was a gun. Henry learned that the man and his family would camp at the park during the same time every year, but they couldn't that year because of COVID, which is why he was angry. He felt it was unfair that I was walking at the park while he was barred out of it. He was upset that his family couldn't do their special camping trip. So I guess when he said we, he meant his family. Anyways, he left eventually and I never saw him at the park again, yet I never forgot about it. I used that event to tell my roommates that this is why we lock the doors. They always felt safe at the house because it was on a state park and a ways out of the city, yet those were the exact reasons why I felt unsafe and always locked the doors when I saw them unlocked. Very weird and creepy situation. I'm certainly glad that I didn't get shot or kidnapped. I'm also glad that I'm anal about locking doors. I'm glad that my large dog was with me, and I'm glad that my roommates were home. I always felt uneasy when I was at that house alone, especially overnight. I couldn't stop picturing that man coming back out of angry revenge. State parks really seem to attract a lot of weirdos. I advise everyone to stay alert, prepared, and safe.
So I've been wanting to post this story for a while, and my kids are tired of hearing about it. I was about 16 or so when this happened, and the instructor in the story was in his 50s, I think. Everyone's old when you're 16. When I was in high school, you would take a driver's education class at some point. It basically went over the manual and basic rules of the road, plus a special viewing of red asphalt, which is faces of death, but with car accidents. Once you'd passed that, you needed to find a local driver's training school to teach you the hands-on part, so that's what we did. One night my instructor showed up to get me for our lesson. I've had chronic back pain since I was 16, and I mentioned something about my back hurting. He had me turn around, put my arms across my chest, and he lifted me up from the back to crack it. Weird? A little. A few lessons in, it was already dark out, and he took me to this spooky back road in the next town over. Every time I began to drift to one side of the road, he would put his hand on the steering wheel and correct me. But after a couple of times of correcting the wheel, he would then put his hand on my thigh. Now, I was a very shy kid, and I hated speaking up, even for myself. But I knew this was not a good situation. Every time he corrected the wheel, he'd put his hand closer to my crotch. This went on for about 5 to 10 minutes, and in my head I was screaming at myself to say something. I had to. So I gathered up all my courage and finally managed to say, "Can you please move your hand? It's distracting me." His hand moved away as fast as humanly possible. So how is this a creepy encounter? Well, I finished my lessons and got my license, and a couple of years later, I was reading the newspaper when I came across an article about a driver's training instructor who'd gotten arrested for molesting his students. Lo and behold, I recognized the name and picture, and it was the same guy. If I had not spoken up, I may have been one of those girls. I'm a 34-year-old female, And this happened to me the summer before COVID parted its proverbial ass cheeks and crapped all over everyone and everything. Upon my pilgrimage to the herniated asshole of Ontario, Oshawa, I grew up as a latchkey kid. I've moved at least once a year for most of my life, so I'm used to new towns and the process of assimilation. As per my usual routine, I decided to take the lay of the land. I always find the nearest LCBO, Canada's liquor store, and I grab a roadie, or a 26, however much I hate myself that day, and look for water and a view. Then I take it in. I found my hooch, I found my spot. It was on the river. Great trout fishing, I hear, with a path that spanned the town and river. I found the perfect spot just right off the trail. The ground was worn from people fishing there, but it was off the path far enough that if someone was with you, you were comfortable being in close proximity and trusted them. Very intimate, sufficiently isolated, and no one is around. At least that's what I thought. Thankfully, I was on the phone with a dear friend. As I was grabbing, smoking, drinking, and being generally awesome, I became aware of a person. A very large person. Think Baby Huey from Looney Tunes or whatever. He was fumbling and looking out of place and seemed nervous, which in turn made me nervous. He clearly had something he wanted to relate to me. So I asked my friend to hold on a sec, and quickly told her there was a strange man I needed to accept candy from. So I asked this big dumb guy if he was all right and if he needed anything. He looked startled, as if pulled out of deep thought. He looked embarrassed. His eyes darted back and forth, and he quickly asked for the time. I obliged, yet he was still standing there as if there for something. He was holding this piece of paper that he'd been fumbling with the whole time. It's an aged lined paper from a school binder or something of the like, folded as small as it would go. Side note, if you haven't already guessed, I'm not very smart, so I was asking him if there was anything else, as I slowly reached for the paper, and he was slowly handing it to me. It just seemed like it was meant for me. I opened it up, and crudely scrawled down was, "Do you wear bicycle shorts?" I read it out loud because, as we've already established, I'm stupid. I looked at him and he looked at me and smirked, and like a shy child I stupidly asked. Sometimes, because I am completely oblivious to the fact that the question was sexual in nature. This man was clearly delayed. He didn't even strike me fit to live on his own. He likely had a PSW and likely had very little unsupervised time. His dress, demeanor, and childlike behavior made it pretty obvious that this man was in the system. He replied, "I like girls that wear bicycle shorts." Well, stupid me then realized where I was and who I was with and what I'd been asked. I think fast and asked him if he smoked. He said yes, and I gave him a handful. My logic was that you're not going to rob or maul someone that is being kind to you. It's kind of a defense mechanism for me. If you terrify me, I will throw smokes at you and get the hell out of there. Then I gently asked, in the sweetest of ways, "Are you going to be a problem?" Then it was his turn to suddenly take his surroundings and realize the position we were both in. He looked terrified. "No," he said, and just took off with his paper. I always felt that he was building up to something he didn't yet have the courage to do. Or perhaps he was just a kind of disabled person that didn't really realize what situation he was putting me in until I asked him if he was going to be a problem. Either way, creepy as hell as far as encounters go. Just avoid the schwa if you can. So this happened a month ago when I went to my grandfather's house with my family, and I was hanging out with my cousins. when my aunt asked me if I could go grab some food dye from her apartment, as there wasn't any at my grandfather's. I said yes and asked my cousin, who was 3 years younger than me, 15 years old, to accompany me so we could hang out more. On the way there we talked, and once we'd arrived at the building, a man, who looked to be in his 40s, wearing dirty clothes and stinking of alcohol and tobacco, was making his way into the building too. He allowed us to go first, so we thanked him and walked in. We came to the stairs, and just then I started to feel really uneasy without knowing why, and was afraid and stressed. Yet my cousin was behaving like everything was fine, and the man wasn't even there. So I played the game. Now you should note that my aunt lives on the top floor, and that at this moment there was no one in her apartment. We talked as we went up the stairs, and still I had this unease in my stomach, as the man was constantly behind us. Then my cousin said something so unbelievably stupid, and I have no idea why she did. "There's no one in the apartment, right?" she said. I whitened and looked at my cousin, letting her know how she'd just done something really stupid, as apparently she didn't feel the discomfort I did. We arrived at the open door of the apartment, and the man was still not far behind. I opened the door quickly and pulled my cousin inside and closed the door behind us. I blew up at her, as I was so angry, but she just shrugged and said I was stressed over nothing. The guy was simply there because he lives there, or he was just going to see some friends that happened to be on the same floor. I calmed down and thought that maybe I was overreacting a bit, and my cousin was probably right. So we went into the kitchen to get the food dye, when just then we heard a strange noise, coming from the front door. I realized then that I hadn't locked it. So I walked over to it to quickly do so, and told my cousin to stay in the kitchen. But it was too late. The doorknob was being turned, and the silhouette of the man from earlier could be seen through the door. I didn't know what to do. He opened the door and I regained my senses, telling him to get out. But he didn't flinch, and suddenly started shouting, "I want my part!" I didn't understand what he was talking about, and told him again to get out before I called the police. All of a sudden he started laughing like a psychopath, and I again, through sheer panic, told him to leave, but this time shouted. He stopped laughing and looked at me straight in the eye, as he slowly walked towards me and said, "Where did you hide it? I know that you're hiding it. Give it to me and I'll leave you alone." "What do you want?" I asked. He took me by the shoulder and shook me, shouting every bad word you could think of, and repeating that I had hidden something that belongs to him. Suddenly then I heard, "Police!" Panicked, the man pushed me to the side and tried to escape, but it was too late and the police had arrived. I watched them immobilize the man and take him downstairs. Then I saw my cousin coming out of the kitchen, crying with the phone in her hand. As everything was happening, I started crying too, and we both hugged each other as one of the policemen tried to reassure us, telling us it was all over. A few days later, after an investigation had started, the police informed us that the man was under the influence of several drugs, and the moment we saw him, he had run out. But what we didn't know was that my aunt's apartment belonged to a drug dealer previously, and that's why he said that he wanted his share and thought that we had hidden it. Now I always have to double check that I've double locked doors, just to make sure. And thankfully, I've not seen that man again. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page, and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.